Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Let's revisit the subject of microtransactions, shall we? I think the last time we talked about this in detail was in regards to Evolve. I did a fairly lengthy piece on that and expressed the opinion that it was really much ado about nothing. Since then, a number of things have occurred that have evolved the discussion somewhat, and there's something quite recent that I would like to discuss, and that is the addition of microtransactions, a trading floor, as they call it, to the early access title Killing Floor 2. In order to understand the outrage surrounding this, though, I think you need to understand the context. This is not an isolated incident. This is not something that stands alone and has not been influenced by other things. Indeed, the discussion has evolved as a result of several developments in several different games, not least of which the addition of crate-based microtransaction drops to Payday 2, a game that had explicitly stated in the past that it would not add microtransactions to its title, and to make matters even worse, said skins also provide actual stats boost as opposed to merely being a cosmetic upgrade. This caused a massive community backlash, and perhaps a justifiable one, and I think has set pretty much everybody on edge when it comes to any sort of similar system. So when a system was announced for Killing Floor 2, coming in the next update called the Trading Floor, which would allow you to acquire strictly cosmetic weapon skins and character cosmetics, there was an uproar, to say the least. A lot of people got very, very upset about it. Now, of course, the situation is not the same as Overkill by any stretch of the imagination, but I would like to talk a little bit about the expectation, I suppose, of the modern gamer when it comes to post-release monetization of a title. I'd also like to bring into the discussion the matter of Overwatch, a title that is not in fact free to play, and yet has also caused some consternation in regards to its announced business model. So before we dig into exactly why everybody's upset and what the current climate is in regards to microtransactions, let's be absolutely clear as to what Killing Floor 2 is doing. Killing Floor 2, for those who do not know, is a cooperative zombie shooting wave-based FPS from Tripwire, the developers of Killing Floor 1, as well as Red Orchestra, Rising Storm, and so on and so forth. They specialize in first-person shooters, and Killing Floor 1 was certainly one of my favorite horde co-op defense games, and honestly, I don't even like that genre that much, but Killing Floor 1 is one of those rare exceptions in which I actually enjoyed it, based on superb gunplay, great post-launch support and development, and all that kind of thing. So Killing Floor 2 entered early access about 7 months ago. I did a preview video before it came out, and since then it's been developed, but fairly slowly. It hasn't had a huge amount of large, significant updates, and some of those who have bought into the early access program for that game have not been too happy about that. The game has had 2 major updates, and according to Tripwire, now actually has more content in it than Killing Floor 1 did on launch, which would actually appear to be accurate. Killing Floor 1 on launch was certainly quite a limited game and received a large number of updates after the fact. However, again, some of the people that bought in are not happy with the rate of development. Now, it was announced that the Trading Floor would be added to the forthcoming update for Killing Floor 2, which is a microtransaction system, and said system is extremely similar to Counter-Strike Go, in which it involves crate drops that can be unlocked with keys that can be purchased either from the Steam store or from the Steam marketplace, so you can trade with other players in order to get them. These crates will contain a single cosmetic, and they can be of varying rarities, as well as varying visual qualities, battle-scarred, field-tested, mint, and so on and so forth. So you're going to get cosmetics that have a higher perceived value, but with a lower drop rate. Of course, you can trade these on the marketplace and all that sort of thing, and there will be ultra-rare golden weapon skins and all that kind of nonsense. The sort of thing we've seen in Counter-Strike Go before. The system is effectively identical. It provides no in-game benefits whatsoever. There are no stat increases on any of the items, and about 90% of the items, according to Tripwire's statement, will be designed by the community, which means that they will be created by workshop creators, and said creators will receive a portion of the profits. Again, it's exactly the same as Dota 2 and Counter-Strike Go when it comes to its microtransaction system, who is developing it and who is really getting the money. That's how the system works. Very simple, nothing out of the ordinary here. Now, in a statement made by Tripwire, the president, John Gibson, was very clear in saying that the people developing said system and making it work are not the same people that develop maps, weapons, monsters, and gameplay. He claims the trading floor in no way delays or impacts new gameplay content, and the trading floor is part of an update with new maps, new perks, gameplay balance changes, and so on and so forth. It is not an independent update, and it has not delayed any content, so they claim. So why are people upset about it? Well, one of the reasons is something that I just mentioned, that some people have claimed that it is delaying new content that they actually want for the game. Now, if Tripwire is to be believed, then this is not actually true. And I would be inclined to believe that they're probably telling the truth for the most part. I don't necessarily believe that this system has been developed entirely without any impact whatsoever on the development of Killing Floor 2. There was probably some sort of cross-pollination going on between these departments. I really don't think Tripwire is big enough to have a separate department solely for microtransactions and all that kind of thing. Other developers probably had to pitch in a little bit. Did it delay it all that much? Probably not. This is a system very similar to Counter-Strike Go, Dota 2, and all manner of other titles, and a lot of the back-end involved in buying, selling, and trading these items is already built into Steam. That's something that Steam does. That's not something that had to be created from scratch by Tripwire. It's also, of course, accurate to say that if the vast majority of your weapon skins are community developed, then your art team isn't spending a lot of time there. Maybe they're touching a few things up, maybe they're doing a little bit of quality assurance, but that's probably about it. So I think it is fairly safe to dismiss that initial concern. A lot of people seem to believe that development is a zero-sum game, that there are a certain number of development points and they must be spent in different areas, and if they're spent in one area, that means they can't be spent in another. That's of course not true, because not everybody in the development team has the same skills and does the same thing. You can't ask an artist to code new content for the game. You can't ask the guy who deals with the hit detection and the network code to go and design a new gun. That's just not how development studios work, and it's also why a great deal of pre-order content and maybe day one DLC is cosmetic, because it's often developed by artists who actually have nothing else to do while the game is being bug tested and essentially polished up for its actual release. However, that argument doesn't necessarily apply to early access titles. This is where this particular issue gets a little bit complicated, because when I looked at Evolve and when I stated that I had no problem with the cosmetic day one microtransactions for Evolve, I believe that it was more of an issue of optics and PR as opposed to any real problem. That game was done, and I have a very clear line that I draw when it comes to post-launch monetization. I believe that when a game is launched, any meaningful content, as in any content that affects the gameplay in any way that is complete and ready to go, should be on the disc and available without additional charge. That means that things like the Day 1 Mass Effect 3 DLC, which caused me to boycott the game because of how damn disgusting it was, where they took a key character and decided to put him behind a $10 paywall on launch, that sort of thing is bollocks. That sort of thing should not be accepted ever, under any circumstances. It's content that affects the gameplay. If it's done, it should be on the disc, and I don't think there are any exceptions to that. I really don't. When it comes to cosmetic content, when it comes to things that are developed prior to release, I do not have as many problems with it. It would be nice if all of that was available on launch and available without extra charge. In fact, I think it's actually a very good idea to reward early adopters with that kind of thing. I think it's a very good way to incentivize early purchases without doing so in a way that is unfair to everybody else, and without doing so in a way that adversely affects the gameplay for those that don't choose to dive in early. I think that that is okay. And it would seem that a lot of developers believe the same, because a lot of these day one or pre-order bonuses are indeed cosmetic. I'm okay with that. I'm fine with it. However, this game is not done yet. That means that the art assets aren't done yet either. As a result, you can't necessarily apply the same argument. You can't say the same thing about a released game. You can't say, well, the artists had nothing to do because the game isn't done yet, so they probably do have something they could be doing, which should be integrated perhaps into the game, and perhaps this did delay something else. If the artists were spending a significant amount of time on microtransaction-based cosmetics, then it's also possible that the next gun that's being implemented in the game was delayed because art resources were diverted to do something else. So in the case of early access, I think that's an argument you actually can make. For a released game, probably not. But if anything, this just indicates what a dodgy business model early access is, and I really don't like it. I genuinely don't. I think it's a bad business model. And you can make the argument that it's used to make sure that certain games actually get released and that they wouldn't be able to come out otherwise, but there are also plenty of examples of games that are perpetually stuck in early access limbo, and even titles from higher profile studios such as Double Fine with space-based DF9 that was never finished. And actually, you could argue that it was never finished because it went into early access and it relied on early access revenue to continue development, and early access revenue is no guarantee whatsoever. Early access is fraught with problems. Early access can cause huge problems with feature creep, for instance. Because you have to listen to those that bought in on early access, there is an expectation that you be very active and involved with those that actually bought in early. As a result, your game's scope may creep massively outside of where it was supposed to be in the first place, and then you run out of money. Early access games are also quite difficult to refund, unless, of course, you decide to refund after the first couple of hours. It may be that I bought into a game and 6 months down the line, that game's abandoned and there's nothing I can do about it. Ultimately, though, I think with early access, there's actually a degree of caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. You know you're buying into something that ain't done yet, and frankly, I feel that buying early access games is bad for the consumer. It's just not a smart play. You're making an unnecessary bet when there are plenty of finished games and known quantities available that you could be buying, instead of buying into something that may never be done, and even if it is, may end up being completely different to when you bought in the first place. The addition of microtransaction systems in the early access process is yet another example of how a game can fundamentally change its business model before its content complete. Yet, could you make the argument that early access is the time to do this? I think that during a game's beta is a great time to make major changes and actually gather that sort of feedback. Is early access technically beta? It's hard to know these days because beta doesn't really mean all that much. It used to have a very clear definition, and now, considering I've just preloaded the open beta for Rainbow Six Siege, a game which is coming out in like a few days, that term beta signifies nothing. It's a demo. That's all it is. I'm preloading the demo. Call it what it is. It's a bloody demo. You're not going to change anything between now and the 1st of December. I think as a result of the advent of early access as well as free-to-play, it is safe to say that once something starts charging, it is open to critique. That is your release, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, don't release it early. Don't put it on early access. Your game will be judged by the state that it's in because you chose to put a price tag on it, or indeed in the case of free-to-play games, you chose to put a microtransaction store in it. A real beta does not charge. When you start charging, it's not a beta anymore. It's just a game that's unfinished and yet has the gall to charge money anyway. What a strange universe we live in 2015 where that's actually become a commonplace business model. Now, I said that I'd try and explain why exactly I think that the current environment and the current mood amongst gamers is as sour as it is towards microtransactions. And we've had developers taking the piss now for years when it comes to this sort of thing. We recently had Assassin's Creed Syndicate release, a single-player-only game that is, of course, infested with microtransactions. Rise of the Tomb Raider is infested with microtransactions, again, a single-player game. And we've even had games like Halo 5 that have multiplayer microtransactions that actually affect the Warzone mode, and they're not purely cosmetic in that regard. Those are examples of microtransactions creeping into almost everything. And some of those are not acceptable. In fact, a great deal of them are not acceptable. I cannot trust Ubisoft not to screw with the process of gathering items and gathering materials in their games, because there is an incentive for them to make it harder. There is an incentive for them to make it a more laborious process to encourage people to just skip the grind and pay. In the case of Killing Floor 2, I think everybody is very on edge as a result of Payday 2 that said, hey, no, we're never going to put microtransactions in. Oh, except when we did, and then we decided that skins should also give you a stat upgrade, which is maybe the dumbest idea I've ever heard, and as far as I'm concerned, the only saving grace is that that game is a PvE game and not a PvP game. If you're going to give skins that give damage upgrades and all that kind of thing, then frankly, you should be selling your games in China, where the Asian markets seem to be entirely okay with that kind of buying power nonsense. Western markets are perhaps becoming okay with it only through the prevalence of it on iOS. There are plenty of games that flagrantly let you buy an advantage when it comes to iOS, and I don't think that's going to be stopping anytime soon because they're making a bunch of money. But I think it maybe even goes deeper than that. The response to Overwatch's monetization strategy, I think, is telling of just how on edge gamers currently are when it comes to game monetization. I had a bunch of people say to me flat out, if I'm paying up front for this game, they should never be selling skins. And to me, I found that very puzzling. Now, Overwatch is charging $40 off the bat, and you get all the characters, at least all the launch characters, and access to all the content, with the exception of a couple of cosmetic skins. We don't know exactly what's going to be happening in future with it. There is a big risk that they start selling hero characters, and at that point I will quit the hell out of that game because that's a terrible idea with a game that is designed around switching compositions on the fly. At that point, you are buying power over your opponent. However, the amount of people that actually objected to the skins is what surprised me. They said, look, if I'm paying for a game up front, I should never have to pay for anything else. That is very confusing to me. At what point did some gamers decide that all post-launch content must be free? Because I've never held that belief. And I think that it's very unhealthy to hold that belief. It's very unrealistic to hold that belief. The vast majority of companies cannot support a game, especially for years, for free, without some sort of additional revenue stream, because most games don't sell consistently over the course of a number of years. They sell consistently over the course of the first month, and then sales drop off, and then maybe they get a boost when they lower the price. But consistently selling copies of a game over the course of a number of years is very rare. It's very difficult. In order to see a game be properly supported, you need another form of revenue, and I think that cosmetic skins, the addition of such after the fact, for microtransaction amounts, or in the case of many games, not so microtransaction. I don't think $10 is a microtransaction anymore, considering you can buy 2 great games at that cost on Steam, is a good way to support the development of that game. I don't think you're entitled to that. I really don't. I don't think you're even entitled to all the skins on launch. You might say, well, it's galling that I don't get all the content that's on the disc, but when it comes to cosmetic content, I think that that is where the line is drawn. If it's content that affects gameplay, I'm with you, 100%. I will march with that pitchfork and torch right along with you. I'll write an angry sign and post it on Facebook. I'll be that activist. But when it comes to cosmetic content, I think that that's where a line has to be drawn, because it's the least harmful way of doing anything. If you can support a game purely by post-launch sales of cosmetics, that is the ideal scenario for everybody. You're milking the people who are loyalists, you're milking the people who have spare money to spend on something that doesn't matter, that just want to pimp their character, basically. And everybody else is gaining the benefit of that. And I think in the case of Killing Floor 2, the way to look at this microtransaction system, even in early access, is that this supports the game and it makes it more likely that development will continue at a good pace. I don't know what the financial situation of Tripwire is. I cannot imagine that Killing Floor 2 has been selling a lot of copies over the past 6 months. It probably got its initial boost and then it died off. I can't really support that argument because, unfortunately, the only service that would track such sales, Steam Spy, has problems whenever there's a free-to-play weekend for any game in its database, and unfortunately, Killing Floor 2 had just that. So no, 725,000 people do not own Killing Floor 2. We have absolutely no idea how many people own it at this point. But I have to say, opening up additional revenue streams even in early access in a way that does not affect gameplay, I think is actually good. And it means that the game is more likely to actually get finished. And really, if you bought in on early access, that's what you want, right? You want the game to get finished. You don't want the game to get abandoned. It's very important, of course, not to blame the customer for a game failing and getting abandoned in early access. If the developer mishandled their budget, that is not the fault of customers. You can't turn around and say, well, if Steam users had bought more copies, this would never be an issue, so it's your fault. No, we're not obliged to buy your early access game. Absolutely not. We're also not obliged to buy your microtransactions in-game, and if nobody does, well, frankly, that's Tripwire's fault, isn't it? You've got to wonder, well, is this the right time to introduce the Z economy? Are there enough people actually actively playing this game to make this system profitable, to make it worthwhile? Was it worth the development time, even if said development time was limited? How many people are currently playing Killing Floor 2? Well, right now it's about 1,000. The 24-hour peak is 1,400. Obviously, that's been a fairly large drop since launch, but it is worth noting whenever the game has a major update, there's always an uptick in players. If this particular trading floor update is also bundled in with a bunch of meaningful gameplay updates, which Tripwire claims it is, then hopefully that will cause a surge in players once again, and this system will be worthwhile. And at that point, it is actually good for the people playing that game, because it does mean there's more money in the kitty to actually finish it. So my conclusion is this. Early access is in general a very bad business model, and it's something that I never recommend that people support. However, people are going to do it anyway, because they just can't wait. They are not that patient. I do not think it is unreasonable for a game to undergo large changes, even in terms of business model, during the early access process, and I feel that if you buy into early access, you are accepting a certain degree of risk. I think the way that Tripwire is doing it is perhaps the least offensive, it is the least egregious, and it is a system that has worked for games like CSGO and Dota 2. I think it is also safe to say that games are never truly finished these days, and CSGO and Dota 2 are examples of that. Those games continue to get major game-changing updates. I don't really think that the early access label also comes along with any kind of assurance, express or implied, that there will be no form of microtransaction added to the game, and Tripwire never promised it. This is not going back on a promise. This is not the same as Overkill doing it, and we're talking about something that does not, in fact, affect the gameplay in any way. I think this is the safest way to do so, and I think that gamers should be supportive of business models that do not change the game, that do not alter the content in any meaningful way. I also think that while it is understandable that gamers would be on edge, considering the amount of companies that frankly take the piss when it comes to microtransactions, and of course recent issues with Overkill, that they should accept that content is not free. Content costs money to make, and once a game has been launched, and this is of course not applying to Killing Floor 2, but once a game has been launched, post-release content that does not involve fixing bugs and balancing the game should not be expected to be free. That does not mean that microtransactions and DLC are good value for money. In fact, in the vast majority of circumstances, one could argue that they are not. And there is perhaps the biggest problem. I don't think anybody would actually be objecting to this sort of stuff as often as they are if DLC was actually good, if it was actually worth the money, and in the vast majority of circumstances, unfortunately, it's not. This is a well that developers both love to dip into and yet have simultaneously gone out of their way to poison by frequently releasing content that is not worth the cost. DLC and microtransactions are not inherently evil, but it is very, very hard to consistently trust developers when so many of them continue to take the mick. Tripwire are not innocent of this. When it comes to Killing Floor, which is a game that I love a great deal, they did start to take the piss later on in its development cycle. It was, of course, years after it came out, but they released weapon packs that claimed to be side grades and arguably were not. At that point, you were actually buying power, and yes, of course, it's a co-op game, but simultaneously, you've got to be very careful with those kind of releases. And were those guns even worth the cost? Were those microtransactions even micro? In many cases, they weren't. So let's not pretend that Tripwire are innocent of taking the piss. They have done it in the past, and as a result, that means that they've lost some trust. In this case, though, if they do what is promised, and they do not expand the scope of this into things that actually affect the game, I really do think that this is reasonable. I think that it's okay. Let's just hope that it stays that way, and really, if you want to avoid things like this occurring, don't buy early access! Please! Please don't do it! It's bad! It's not a good business model! Buy games that are done! There are so many, and there's so many good ones! Please do that instead! Oh dear. There you go, folks. That's my opinion on that particular matter. If you like this video, feel free to click that like button, and of course, if you disliked it, the dislike button is right next to it, you evil monster. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.